Well, many years ago, a young Asmongold came home from his dad's house after eating barbecue, and he looked at a computer, and he looked on Twitch. It was one of the first times he ever went on there, and he watched his favorite streamer, Kripparrian, and he saw Kripparrian playing a new game. And that new game, he was fighting a bear inside of a cave. The year was 2012. And the first time ever I saw Path of Exile with Kripparrian talking to Chris Wilson here. And I, that day, donated my $15 out of the $20 that I had in my bank account to continue playing the Path of Exile closed beta. And 8 or 9 years later, today, here on Allcraft, we are joined by Chris Wilson, Managing Director of Path of Exile. Welcome, Chris.
Hey, it's great to be here. I'm a big fan as well.
Thank you so much.
I have a story as well. One time I got fired and I played PoE for 3 months straight without doing anything else, and it was the best employment I've ever had.
That's about where we're at. So, Chris, obviously we have a ton of questions. You've obviously got the huge league coming up tomorrow. You've got PoE 2 coming up. First thing I want to get into is, with this new league coming up, obviously you've got a ton of really big changes, a ton of things that are happening. What are you most excited for in this new league in terms of all the changes that players are going to see?
So there's two key things that I really like about it. The first one is that I think we've done a really good job with getting the combat right in Expedition. It's something we were a bit uncertain about with the last couple of leagues. We've kind of historically been doing combat through just spamming monsters at the player, and that has been challenging, but it hasn't been the type of combat we're wanting. And in Expedition, we've really put a lot of work into making the monsters have more interesting abilities. So the moment-to-moment actual gameplay of doing the Expedition should be noticeably better than what people were getting in Ultimatum. Secondly, because I'm a complete item nerd, and people say my only role here is to make sure the items are good.
Talismans.
We've been putting a lot of work into making sure that the interesting vendor mechanics in this league are going to be really exciting. Like, we've got this gamble window, which we've been playing with a lot this week, and it's just impactful and fun to play with. And we have this haggle system where people can try to negotiate to get items from the vendor, and that stuff there is a lot of fun to play with.
Yeah, the all of the different like gambas, and also, like you said, like the haggling, and also it looked like you can actually negotiate as well to like continue to upgrade pieces and see where it goes. That looks like a lot of fun to me. I do want to go a little bit broader for a second, because I know a lot of the people who are probably watching right now probably have questions outside of the league that we've probably really never gotten a chance to talk about before. And one of the biggest questions that I've always wanted to ask is, what's it actually like when you're kind of looking at a new league, when PoE's been such a progressive game, where you continue to add to what a core is going to look like. You continue to add more mechanics to a game. And for some of the new players, it continues to be a more complicated system. Like, what's the actual thought process like? Are you more focused on, okay, we've had these diehard players that have played every single league, so they already have that lexicon of knowledge? Or do you kind of think about some of the new players and try to find that middle ground?
We have to make sure that the new content affects both groups of players. Like, it's obviously very tempting to make sure that we just put the content at the end game and, existing players will understand it. But we want to make sure that all our new content is available right throughout the game as people play. So if a new player hits Path of Exile, excited to find out what people are talking about, they'll get into this Expedition content that we've just released immediately. And this means we kind of have to make sure that it's understandable at face value. Someone can pop into an Expedition or do these vendor interactions, and at first glance, they'll know what's going on. They don't need to have played the game before. But on the other hand, it has to be deep and appropriate for the level of knowledge that existing players have. There have to be cool quirks in there. There have to be things they can find, interactions with other game systems. And so it's become easy for us to design content for both groups of players, but it took some adjustment at first.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's kind of interesting whenever you first come into the game on a new league and you're instantly faced with the new league mechanic in like Act 1 on the beach right there. And I always do find that really interesting to see how it is. And also, like, with the new league mechanic, you're redesigning, or at least with the goal. Obviously, you said you're doing, I think, Act 1 in this first league. You're going to be redesigning a lot of the power differences inside of the campaign itself, comparative to the league mechanics too.
Absolutely. We've honestly felt for a while that the campaign has just been way too easy, and this is in contrast to the League mechanics themselves. You'd have a thing where someone is playing through and they encounter a ritual or a breach or something like that, and that's
Yeah.
challenging and fun, and the monsters have a lot of hit points and it's good content, and then they go back to breezing through regular content. So here we're trying to both level the playing field a bit so all the content is engaging and appropriately rewarding, as well as actually making sure that the game's got some of its sharp edges back. Like historically, Path of Exile was pretty hardcore. Like there were a lot of monsters that would just outright kill you, and
Oh, I
players
didn't
were.
know that.
It was a bit kind of Dark Souls-like in some ways, that players were
Yes.
actually like excited about the prospect of trying to get through the campaign because it was challenging. And so
Yeah.
that's something we've been working on, bringing back some of the sharp edges there.
Yeah, that's kind of one of my questions though, because I totally understand where you're coming from with that. But there are some players that really struggle with some of the mechanics, even if they are easier, like Quinn69. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. I know that he's one of the players that probably makes it so the game has to be tuned to be a little bit easier so he can get through even the most basic content. So
Oh, I mean, there's a lot of people too, okay? Like, not me, of course, but obviously, like, whenever you're redesigning the campaign and trying to make it a little bit more difficult, one question I kind of have is that you've got to have, like, a huge amount of people coming into the game of all different varying skill levels. Does it concern you about making the campaign or making the game at a baseline more difficult or harder to do because some of the lower skill players won't really be able to keep up?
Our goal here is that low skill players can still get through the campaign. It's just an experience where they have to actually think about how characters are being planned, learned about game mechanics. Occasionally they'll stop and have to reevaluate strategy. And to be honest, the situation we were having before was that new players who hadn't even played very many games before were, it wasn't too difficult to get through the 10 acts. It took quite a slight amount of attrition, but it was a little easier than we would have liked it to be. And so, as with many things in action RPGs, you can kind of pick your battles here. You can choose the speed at which you're progressing through. You can choose which content you engage with in the campaign. There's side quests. Side areas are often a bit harder than the mainline ones. There are various mechanics like the ability to revive at a checkpoint that didn't exist in old Path of Exile that do mean that it's still, not as crazy as it was initially in the closed beta. But we just want to make sure that each type of monster has a way of scaring you. There's something it's going to do that could be dangerous, because honestly, a lot of the monsters were just bags of small hit points before.
So that's kind of like one thing that's happened, and this has kind of been like the meta from Path of Exile, and I think it's become more and more the case recently. And I'm sure the changes that are being made are to kind of counteract this, where the meta for a lot of builds is to just do so much damage that the boss literally doesn't do any mechanics. And do you feel like the changes that are being implemented tomorrow with the new league are going to kind of counteract that and make the bosses actually a little bit more fleshed out, even for bosses and things that people might not have necessarily had to deal with before?
Yeah, it's kind of sad. Something that our design team said is, we just want the boss or the monster to have the ability to do one attack. Come on, let it get its first attack off at least, right? And that's our baseline here, is that we don't want it so that you melt the screen full of monsters before they get a chance to physically activate. And now they do get their first attack off, and maybe that'll slow you down. Maybe there'll be a roadblock there. We expect that the top players in the game with the crazy builds will still be able to steamroll a lot of the content, right? Like, we're not completely changing how people play, but it is going to mean that an average player actually has a slightly more interactive experience. And I get that this sounds scary because people don't want their experience to change with Path of Exile. They know and love what they've got, but it honestly is a lot more fun at the moment. Like, I recommend just trying it. We've been daring people in the office, just play through the campaign, tell us what you think. And they come back saying, when are you going to do the other acts? When will this be at the same quality level? Because we've got Act 1 and about half of Act 2 ready so far. It's exciting and it's a lot of fun, and we're quite keen to see what people think when they've actually played it this weekend.
I think people get really used to being able to zoom, go through like Maze of the Minotaur in 2 minutes or something like that and just clear it really fast. And the idea of it taking 5 is scary, absolutely. But the reality is, like, yeah, I mean, as somebody who's played for like on and off for years, it definitely has become very repetitive in that way, where you just kind of constantly, like, you just build more and more damage, you kill everything, and your health usually isn't really that high, and defensive layers aren't really that important outside of hardcore. And so this will probably, I'm assuming, add a little bit more scope to building a character and making people think outside of the box of just only offensive abilities. But one concern that I kind of have, and I think that I've seen a lot of other people have, is that whenever you're looking at kind of nerfing everything down, do you run the risk of accidentally or inadvertently making only a certain amount of builds viable because you're taking down the viability of, let's say, some of the almost good builds, and you take those into being not viable? Or do you feel like the changes with the other skill gems and other things that are being changed will offset that?
Our goal here has been to try to get a wide variety of different builds playable, and there are two ways of achieving that, right? You can apply really heavy buffs to basically anything that isn't currently very played, and we have done a little bit of that. Or you can do our approach, which is to nerf the systems that are the most, I guess, abusable in crazy builds, to take some of the edge off, like to reduce the gap between the amazing and the just very good.
Yeah.
And then basically rebalance the rest of the game around it. So our express goal here is that previously there were a small handful of really, really good builds, and our goal here is now that while the power of those top-end builds is reduced, the group of builds that people are considering playing is significantly broader. And this is helped a bit by the fact we've introduced 19 new skills in this expansion, because that means there's also the introduction of some new toys to play with here. It's going to be very unclear as to what the new builds are that are great. And honestly, if every Path of Exile release we had uncertainty about what people should be playing, that is quite an interesting situation. It would mean that people actually have to experiment, and they don't just jump right into the best build and have the game be over in a week. There's this kind of process of working out what the new cool things are. And so we like the idea of mixing it up a bit with each release, so that players don't just walk in expecting that they've already solved the meta and the game's over in 2 days.
Yeah, carrying golems again. Exactly. I agree.
Yeah, I think like one of the things as a player that I've always found interesting about the game was trying to figure out what that chase build was, the one that's kind of unrealistic, whether you're going for something like a self-curse build or you're trying to be like that aura stacking build that happened. The question that I have is, do you see builds almost getting funneled? Like you want a large variety of builds that somebody can league start with and then get into the end game with, and then have a few of those chase builds? Or do you want the top end to also be much more open as to what's viable for the fastest clearing builds?
We definitely want the fastest builds to be a lot more broad. We want it so that previously when there's like 3 to 5 really strong builds, that'd be great if that was 10 to 12. Ideally larger, and we've tried very hard to achieve that here. We'll see, of course. And realistically, when you generate a pile of random outcomes, one of them is going to be better than the other. So there could be something that's great, but at least we have better tools now for managing that. Previously, we were somewhat powerless to make certain changes because systems weren't set up in a particularly fun way. Like the flask system, for example. Previously, you got a lot of power from each flask buff, and you had 5 of them, and you could keep them on basically all the time. Like, there were some numbers that were just way out of whack there. We'd get situations where we see something and go, we'd easily cut that by 75%, and it would still be great, like flask charge gain in maps. And so now we've actually gone and done a bunch of those changes. It means stuff is much closer to where it needs to be. We can adjust things with much smaller incremental changes in the future.
So it seems to me like one of the things that you're trying to work towards, because yes, people pianoing flasks is, I think it's kind of, it seems at a certain point redundant, right? If you're always going to have the flask buff up, then why is the flask even there at a certain point? So are the changes kind of trying to add a certain amount of actual like second to second gameplay decision making that a person has to do, rather than just kind of them zoning out at the beginning of the map and just clearing, and give them more decisions that they can make inside of the map to change the outcome?
Absolutely. And we've tried very hard to be aware of the things where players were happy with not having to make decisions. Like with the flask system now, not only have we made it so there's the tactical play of using flasks in response to stuff, but for players who don't want to do that, we've added things with opportunity costs that will use flasks automatically for you. So you can put these things called instilling orbs on your flasks so they trigger under certain conditions. And so that's kind of a nod to the players who don't want to have to time something. They can get the timing automatically in exchange for giving up some other opportunity they would have had with additional power for their flasks, for example.
Just like cast on damage taken, effectively, things like that.
Yeah, it's like that. So you can have it so there's a flask that turns off ignite when it's on you in response to being ignited. Like that basically guarantees that the first ignite is not going to trigger, then you get a period of immunity, and if you manage your flasks well, you don't have to worry about ignite. But the player who puts the enkindling orb on the flask, which makes it more powerful, and then has to manage the timing themselves, will get rewarded because they get much better results if they're able to hit the key at the right time. And so it lets players who don't feel they have the skill have some avenue for getting the timing right. And for everyone else who's really good at timing stuff and has the reactions of a 17-year-old and so on, then they can, get more power.
Okay, well, it looks like I'll be having mine on cast on damage taken. So that's okay. I agree with that. I think that's really great. Honestly, like it does kind of, it did become an endeavor that you just had to get your immunity flasks and you had to get these things. And now also I thought actually one point that you brought up, I forgot if this was in the the post that you made last night or not, but it was the changes to the mob density that these maps have. Because back in 2013 or something, you just didn't have the same level of mob density now. And now you have all of these overlapping map mechanics that are all combined together, where people are just having full flask charges all of the time. Whereas back then, having an elite pack was actually kind of, a yellow pack was kind of like, okay, let's see what this is.
Yeah, you're completely right. There are so many more monsters now, and I should emphasize that's not something we've changed here, right? Like, we like there being a lot of monsters. It's fun to plow through them, and it's awesome that players have ways to juice their maps like that. But it was causing them to get so many flask charges that the flask was staying on full power all the time. So we essentially had this thing that you were meant to press occasionally that made you very powerful, and players can literally press it multiple times per second without consequence.
Yeah.
And so there's more balance to that now. It's just in a better state. I don't know how we let it go so long, to be completely honest. It's partly because when you start to change one of these systems, you really have to change it properly, because no one wants to see a series of 10 small nerfs league after league to try to get it in the right place. In this case, we're kind of ripping the Band-Aid off and saying, okay, we've made a lot of changes at once. It's better now. Why don't you try it? And we think that when people do try it, they'll see why we've made the changes.
So that's basically your advice to people who are very skeptical, because honestly, like, going into this interview, I've asked a lot of people questions, seen what they want to ask, etc. And a lot of people are skeptical, and your advice is just try it out, see what it's like.
We wouldn't make the changes if we thought they were bad for the game, right? We want people to enjoy the game.
Yeah.
You know, it's our livelihoods, it's our passion. We're here to bring fun to people. And so we believe this is actually a better game. And this is from a group of people who play the game at very high levels. You know, we have people who top the ladders when they play it, and they don't want the game to be worse, right? If they walk into my office and say, Chris, we are making the game worse with this change, I will listen to them and we'll work out what we're doing. And there's a lot of positivity about these changes in the office. And for people who were skeptical internally, we've encouraged them to try it out and see how fun they find it. And there's obviously tons of rounds of feedback that have gone into taking their feedback on board and continuing to iterate on it before release, of course.
One thing that I find is kind of ironic about the criticism, and I haven't played it yet, obviously, so I can't really say. But I feel like one of the main positives and one of the main areas of excitement that people saw in Path of Exile 2 was being able to see those boss fights that were more drawn out, and that combat that was more nuanced rather than screen clearing with one button. So comparing that, is this kind of trying to move the pace of gameplay closer to what we're going to be expecting to see in Path of Exile 2?
It's moving in that direction, yeah. I mean, we're still working on a long-term plan for this, because Path of Exile 2's campaign is designed so that it's relatively tactical and scary and considered, if you see what I mean. The pace we've been showing with our announcement videos for it is obviously a much slower pace than what people are clearing maps with at the moment. And while fast map clearing, of course, is going to be part of Path of Exile 2, we kind of want to make sure that the power comes at a slower pace so that you do get an ability to actually enjoy the storyline and the moments that we've made that are very cinematic. Now, we can't just nerf everything in the game by 80% in one go, and that's not what the intention is. We're not trying to necessarily interpolate between our current point and Path of Exile 2's release, but we're doing this first set of changes for the sake of the current Path of Exile, and we'll see where we land afterwards. It may be that players enjoy the pace of combat a bit better now, and that gives us the ability to continue to make adjustments over time. But what we do know is that we have to experiment with this and have to get it right before Path of Exile 2's release, because we can't gamble on releasing a new game that's entirely different than the current one and saying, do you like it? It'd be much better to use the existing platform we have to find out whether people like it in advance. It's like the ultimate market research to some extent, having an existing ARPG to make changes in.
I like that perspective a lot. Yeah, it's A/B testing, seeing what the players like, and trying to bracket in what the pacing is that's the most rewarding and also the most fun for the players. Because I know whenever I'm doing some of the league mechanics, especially the current league mechanics, there's massive incongruency between whenever I'm doing an ultimatum, that's terrifying. But whenever I'm clearing the rest of the map, that's really not as much. And I think the idea is to try to bring those two differences together to where you're fighting the mobs outside of these league mechanics that are not necessarily just, you're not even paying attention, and then the league mechanics you're worrying every single split second of dying, and that's why you're pianoing your flasks.
Absolutely. We had this thing where when we were introducing league mechanics, the team knew how to balance those and make them fun, and so they've been working on that, and no one's been complaining about the fun levels of the new content we've been introducing. Yeah. But in the background, the rest of the game is kind of just completely out of whack. And it's amazing how much we didn't realize this for so long, right? We kind of had an epiphany almost 6 months ago where we realized that there is such a numerical difference between these two sets of content. The stuff that was balanced for 2012 player values versus the new stuff.
Yeah, going back and doing Breach nowadays is not, it's not the same as what it used to be. I remember that was a completely different experience whenever it first came out. So I definitely agree with that. And I think that also, like, whenever you're talking about the abilities too, one thing that's kind of cool while you're leveling, right, is like one thing that I'll always do is I'll get like Summon Phantasm support back in Act 1 because they're actually pretty good then. And then, you know, throughout the game, they become less effective. But one thing that I noticed that you're doing is you're changing and you're rebalancing a lot of these different secondary support gems, where these secondary support gems are going to be at least much more congruent in terms of their power gain. Because there are some things like Controlled Destruction, I believe, is being nerfed in terms of its critical strike component, and a few other things are being nerfed because they just become, basically they become so powerful that the option ceases to exist. Is that how you basically see it, or how's that going to work?
Yeah. You're completely right, because there are too many support gems that are just adding direct damage, and the correct choice, the choice I would make, that anyone would make, is to put all of the direct damage support gems on so you can clear maps faster. And the really interesting variety of ones like Summon Phantasm and so on, just we're not seeing any use, and it's because they're the wrong thing to use. And so by making some adjustments, and they're not gigantic nerfs, but some nerfs to the damage ones, the difference is now a lot smaller. It's much easier to justify Summon Phantasm, for example, because bearing in mind the entire game has been rebalanced around this new reality, there's less of a difference between those and the pure damage support gems. And again, this is a case of us being careful here. We could have nerfed the support gems so much more so that Summon Phantasm really does feel like the right choice. But we decided not to. We just took the edge off these. We tried to reduce the gap in a way where people's builds still work if they're stacking damage support gems. It's just that the discrepancy between that player and a player playing a slightly more interesting build is not as high.
So I guess like one way to compare it is that there are some games that whenever it's like, let's say you're playing a fire mage and then the next patch they nerf it and now you want to play the ice mage instead. Whereas here, what you're trying to do is kind of just make fire mage still good, but make ice mage better as well, and try to bring them not necessarily to get people to change what they're doing, but to have the option to do something different.
That's correct. And we've also found as well that there are so many skills that are sitting in the game waiting to be discovered, various combos where, like, we'll see things crop up on the top build lists and we're thinking, we didn't buff any of these at all, anytime recently. They've just been there waiting for someone to discover that particular combination. Or maybe some new gem gets released that works well with a combination of existing stuff. Mm-hmm. And so we are careful that when the players ask us to buff all of the underperforming skills, we look at some of the underperforming skills and say, these are actually in a pretty good state. And of course, we can find stuff to buff every time. There's 20-something skills we've improved here. But our goal basically is to make sure that they're all in a good state theoretically so that players can work out good combinations with those skills. It's like almost Magic the Gathering, where you've got a catalog of 10,000 cards available for people to work out what synergizes with what whenever you release new content. And so out of the 19 new gems we're releasing, I suspect people will find interesting combos of those plus older content.
Yeah, I'm actually really excited for that too. I think that's one of the coolest things with the new PoE leagues, especially whenever they bring out new there's like new like legendary or unique items, and they synergize really well just randomly with something that came out 7 years ago from like Bestiary or something like that. Like I love that. I think that adds a certain amount of just scope to the game. And going through maps, and this is something that I've heard many times people talking about, especially in Ultimatum and to a little bit of a lesser extent in Ritual League, is that there was a certain amount of fatigue with going through maps where you would have to interact with a large number of the league mechanics that would just all be stacked on top of each other in each map. Is that something that you're looking to change, or is that something that you're happy with the state it's in now?
Well, there are two things to note here. The first one is the rate at which you're encountering the new league, how common that should be. And this is actually a big topic in the office, right? We experimented with Expedition, having it only occur in 50% of the areas you encounter before maps. So as you're playing through the campaign, it only occurs occasionally. And we tested that out, and feedback internally was negative, and we eventually put it back to 100%. And so there's been iteration and playtesting there to try to work out the correct rate. We currently believe that it being present in every area is probably the right place for it, because people are here to play the new content, so we make sure it's available for them. And then the second issue is old content that you're encountering, because there's so many Path of Exile systems you encounter 5 or 10% of the time. And that's what you're talking about when you're in a map, and there's just so much stuff going on. And that's something that we have more control over now with the new Atlas passive system, the ability for players to specialize in certain content. And so there may be a future where, for example, stuff spawns at quite a low base rate, and players can choose to really amp up certain stuff to a much higher level, letting people kind of specialize, whether they're a person who wants to be doing more delving, more incursions, and so on and so on. And so that's certainly something that we want to work on over time. And this strategy is discussed, like, maybe every time we introduce a league into the core game, we have to drop one of the old ones out or make it optional, and things like that to manage the fact that, let's say Path of Exile 2 is a couple of years away, right? That's another 8 leagues that are hopefully all integratable into the core game that will be high quality and appropriate for Path of Exile 2. And so we have to make sure that there aren't too many competing for the player's attention at once.
Yeah, I think that's... Go ahead, Rich.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I think that's one of the interesting things, that whenever the other different Atlas abilities, I remember like Incursion League was like completely reworked a few leagues ago as well. And they changed everything, right? With like Maven and the Atlas progression and being able to choose those things. And I always thought that was really interesting because it allowed people to make their own decisions and kind of choose their own type of end game. And also in terms of end game, crafting has been obviously something that's gone very back and forth. Harvest has been in and out of the game. How do you feel about the state of Harvest right now in the game and the scope of crafting and how complex it can be?
Harvest was an experiment, the idea being that, well, we want to know where crafting should be for Path of Exile 2, what the consequences of pretty radical changes to the crafting system are. And honestly, crafting is kind of the key thing in Path of Exile, because the game is, at the end of the day, is about getting awesome items that your friends don't have, right? You want good items, and you want them to be something that other people do not have, so that you feel special about having them. And so one of the main ways of getting items, especially in modern Path of Exile, is crafting. And so we do not want to leave any stone unturned there. We must investigate every way of doing crafting. And the best way to investigate it is to throw it at the players and see what happens. And so our Harvest experiment was a great success in telling us exactly what happens with very deterministic crafting. Unfortunately, we learned that when you say, okay, that was a bit much, let's tone it back, then there's basically a riot with pitchforks because people liked that. And we've learned that it's hard to take toys away in that way. It certainly changed how people played the game. Many people preferred it. Other people agreed that there were problems with the trivializing item acquisition. And so there's a place for deterministic crafting in the game. And it's probably not exactly to the extent that Harvest was, but our intention isn't to just deny determinism entirely in the future. We're still working on it. But with the data we got from that experiment was incredibly valuable for the future of the game.
So do you think that crafting right now in the state that it's in is going to be something that we can kind of expect to see in Path of Exile 2 and in future leagues moving into that? Or do you think that there's going to be more reductions in the amount of types of crafting you can do in terms of deterministic and also just the extreme types of crafting gear, where you have like an explodey chest that has critical strike rating, like massive life roll, and also extra curse on hit? Or is that something that you consider actual like healthy progression for a character?
I think that we'll see the item progression and crafting in Path of Exile 2 be in a different place to where we're at the moment in Path of Exile 1. I have kind of a love-hate relationship with Path of Exile 1's item system. On one hand, I am incredibly proud of it and feel that it is the best item system in any game I have played. On the other hand, I feel it is somewhat terrible at the moment and has bad incentives. It's spammy. You have to see so many different items. You leave hundreds of rare items on the ground. I just see so many problems with how it currently is. And we're working on careful solutions to these. And so it's tricky because, I mean, I still personally feel that it's one of the better item systems I've played in a game, even despite its current problems. But I think it could be so much better. And we want better for Path of Exile 2. And so that's something we're going to carefully work towards in Path of Exile 1. And I emphasize carefully because we understand people don't want changes that are scary, and item changes especially are very scary. So don't worry too much about that statement. But we do want to make sure the item system is in a much better place. And I think the topics you're bringing up about how crafting should work in Path of Exile 2 are key to that, because we have to make sure that when that game releases, that the itemization is perfect in terms of pacing.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big factors. Absolutely, is you have, I've seen plenty of clips where, there are people that are afraid to press the alt button whenever they're in like a full delirium map because they're worried they might get disconnected with so many items. And I think that obviously like there's a certain coolness to it, but I feel like that kind of is tangential, and not really tangential. It happens parallel actually with the amount of power creep that the game has had, because you're just having more rewards, and then you're also having more powerful monsters. And these two things are almost having an arms race against each other. And I think that the changes that you're trying to do are to, I guess, scale that arms race back. Will we be seeing a reduction in loot before Path of Exile 2, or is that something that you're really just waiting for that big overhaul to do?
Well, there are two axes there. The first one is a reduction in the number of items you see. I think everyone would agree that they want to click less stuff and they want to have less unreadable stuff all over the ground, right? The second question is there a reduction in power or not? And that's the tricky one, because taking away player power for the sake of it will kill the game, right? Like it's just not going to be acceptable to do that, right? And so we're looking at ways to rebalance this so that the game remains fun and players don't just feel that we lobotomized their item drops, right? Like it's got to be done in a clever way, and we have to make sure that the game feels rewarding moment to moment to play. And people, in response to us making the game harder, have asked for more rewards. They say, Chris, you're making the game more challenging. That's great. I'm looking forward to it. Can I get more stuff in return? Can you trivialize or make easier some of these grinds that I'm doing? Can you give me exciting stuff to look forward to? And we want to deliver exciting stuff. We were also cognizant of the fact that at the moment, the game gives you a lot of items to look at. And so ideally, an end solution here is that players don't have to click as many things, they don't have to read as many things, and they have a compelling power curve that they're really happy with that doesn't feel like a big step back from the current one. And we have some ideas here that we're working on internally and have been for some time. There's our grand decluttering plan where we essentially reduce a lot of items you don't actually need to see. If you've just cleared a map and there's lots of rares on the ground, you really don't need to see the white items necessarily. And so there's a bunch of stuff we're doing for this. We've talked to the community a bit about it before, but they'll be able to hear more in the coming months of what we're actually actively doing this year on this topic.
Well, that's actually something really interesting to me, because one of the main leagues that I just completely no-lifed was Metamorph League. And I remember in the beginning of Metamorph League, you would actually have to pick up the flesh samples, and then throughout the league, I think it was maybe a couple of weeks after the league was like into play, you made it to where the items no longer needed to be picked up and they were automatically looted to your inventory. And I was wondering what your philosophy was in terms of having items that players always want to loot, like let's say a Chaos Orb or an Exalted Orb. Obviously, I think those are one of the things where you want to see somebody drop it and pick it up themselves. But what is your philosophy based on like the delineation between items that you have to pick up yourself versus items that are automatically looted to your character? Because there's a lot of people that whenever you're going through a map, you spend a lot of your time clicking and looting all these little things.
So when we set out to create Path of Exile, we knew that the items were going to be the most important thing. That thing I mentioned before of having something valuable that took a lot of effort or luck to get that your friends don't have, and so they respect the fact that you've got it. And in order for everyone to respect items, we've treated items as a first-class citizen in the game. They are the important thing. Our database is optimized for items. It's basically the way the game is. And part of this is we understood that we enjoyed the games where you had, to some extent, big clunky items that had to be individually manipulated. They took up a lot of room in the inventory. Basically, like, you're spending a lot of time micromanaging, getting your items from place to place. We enjoyed those more than games that essentially trivialize it to a giant spreadsheet where, as you walk by, the items magically appear on a list somewhere. And that's because we felt more ownership of the items that were, honestly, a pain to deal with. So with that as a baseline philosophy, we also understand the fact that if in the game we say 20 things are going to drop in each area that you must click on, in addition to the base game, do we actually need a player to make those mouse clicks if they're just some kind of thing used in the league and they're not a magical, new, powerful, unique item or an Exalted Orb? And that's why we start with the baseline approach of having stuff be clickable, because we really don't want to regress the expectation of items having weight and requiring manipulation. But in the case of things like Metamorph, for example, it was relatively easy to talk us in to having that stuff be automatically picked up. We discussed it internally before we released the league. There were team members who said, you need the stuff to be automatically picked up. Reddit is going to have a fit over it. We said, well, maybe, and decided to release with the items requiring manual pickup. Reddit had a fit over it. We were told that they told us so, and we made the change, and that's fine, right? Like, I would rather be cautious, because I think jumping to have everything be automatic is entirely the wrong direction. I think it's a slippery slope where at the end of the day, you have a spreadsheet of thousands and thousands of items you have, and you don't really care at that stage what your items are.
So it's about like kind of reducing just the overall, like the scope of clicking is something that you don't want to really necessarily remove, where there is kind of an opportunity cost. Because in a way, if you're going through and you're collecting all of the blacksmithing whetstones or all of the armorer's scraps, that's time that you're spending in the map that you could be spending something else. And it does indirectly create value for those lesser value items, because there are people that don't really have as much time to do that because they're farming higher tier maps that can farm better stuff, that might want to buy those from somebody else. And I think that's kind of... Go ahead.
Yeah. You're completely right. In fact, one of the things, so our game is also published in China by Tencent, and there are various things that the Chinese publishing team have requested that are appropriate for the Chinese market. You know, they have these premium pets you can get, which will pick up currency of low value. So there's a threshold of anything that's worth less than this amount, the pets will pick up for you. And we're happy for that as an experiment. I mean, we would never do a paid, functionality thing like that on our realm, because we don't do the pay for advantage thing. And there's a very light amount of that in the Chinese version, like this auto pickup thing for non-valuable currency. But it is fascinating to see the economic effect, where a good majority of the players have a thing that goes around with them picking up the low value items, because that means there are a lot of those low value items in the economy. As you say, on our realm, a player has to make the choice of, do I want to spend the time clicking the whetstone or not? If they do, they get whetstones. That affects their value. On the other hand, the person who doesn't click the whetstone may get to kill more monsters and get more exalted orbs that way. And so it's really interesting looking at the economic differences between the realm where at the moment players have to make a choice of what they put their clicking attention on, versus the realm where it automatically picks up the low value stuff.
The economics of opportunity cost, basically.
Exactly. And I don't want the player to make too many clicks. Like at the moment, there are too many clicks in Path of Exile. I completely agree. The thing is, I would rather that the clicks were focused on... Let me rephrase that. If we generally had fewer overall items that you had to consider and click, then the number of clicks the player is willing to spend could be spent on items that feel like they have value to the player. And so I feel the way of attacking this is not to auto pick up too much stuff. It's to reduce the amount of stuff players have to think about in terms of item drops. Like, it would be nice if you actually got to look at and consider a fewer number of items rather than kind of glaze over thousands and thousands of them.
But I think that goes back to the original point that you mentioned about how players get scared whenever you talk about reducing the amount of item bloat and stuff like that. And I think, is that one of the main concerns that you have going into that reduction of loot and reduction of currency, that people would view it as like just being too much?
We want to make sure that when we do experiment with reductions, that we're not actually realistically taking away anything that they expect in order to be able to play the game, right? Like, there may be stages here where we're able to reduce the amount of hassle they get without actually reducing the amount of item acquisition. And the other thing here that's kind of the elephant in the room is, right now, people aren't finding their gear from the ground. Like, we're talking about a situation where the ground is littered with items. That's not where they're really getting their good rares from. They're getting those from crafting, right? You know, the correct direction to... Put it this way, you can lobotomize crafting more, strip all that shit out, sorry for my language, or you can, which is obviously completely, not the right direction. Lobotomizing crafting would kill the game very quickly. Or you can substantially increase the quality of the items that come from the ground. And given that we're already looking at the ground being a compelling source of items, and reducing the number of things on the ground, it begs the question of, like, do we just start dropping better rares from the core game? There's a lot of internal discussion about this, and we have a few strategies we're going to try first. We're not ready to talk about them yet, but we're consciously aware of the fact that we have to make sure that this is an experience that is still rewarding for players.
That makes sense. Yeah, Rich, good.
No. So I think one of the big things that I wanted to ask as well a little while ago, I've been holding on to this question. When you actually mentioned some of the things with Reddit, I think you guys have a very different approach to dealing with the community. For us, we've gotten the pleasure to talk to quite a few different game developers at this point, and it does really feel like you do pay attention to what the players say. But how do you feel about looking at Reddit? Like, how much can you actually learn from looking at small portions of the community and trying to learn from what they're saying, or talking to different content creators? How much does that actually add to, like, your insight into what you want to build?
It's incredibly valuable, because at the end of the day, these are people who, A, are spending so much of their free time playing the game that any feedback they have represents an actual point that's causing them to have less enjoyment from the game. And in addition, these are people who, they're so passionate about the game that when something potentially jeopardizes their future enjoyment of it, they will get very heated and let us know about the concern that they have. And we like in that way that when someone posts something that's very upset about the game, this is because this is a person who likes what we have made and is worried that we are making it worse with the change. And that shows a communication failure on our part. It means that if we firmly believe that it's a good change, we have to make sure that that is conveyed in the marketing of it. So every time Reddit is upset, we say either we made the wrong choice here, we misunderstood our customers, or we miscommunicated it. And I would like to think we're making the right choices and understand our customers well. And so we're very much focusing on how we can improve communication with Reddit and with the rest of the community, of course. Now, Reddit is an interesting one because that's a particular community due to the upvoting system where it's very easy for people to drown other people out. People will say to me, Chris, just for your information, I liked this change, but I'm not going to post that on Reddit because I'm just going to get downvoted. It's a waste of time for me to express an opinion that isn't what the hive mind thinks, which is a bit of a shame, but it certainly lets us see the most popular opinions and the rationale behind those. And those are important for us to learn from, because at the end of the day, if we say, oh, that top 10% of players don't matter, who really cares what they think, then the impression of the game and the overall community will be very negative. And we want to make sure that everyone is happy with the game, not just the people who agree with our philosophies.
That's
For sure.
absolutely true.
One of the other reasons that I wanted to bring up the Reddit right now, too, I'm looking through it currently, but Asmon made a post on his subreddit, so everyone who's watching, if you have any questions that you do want to ask throughout the show, there's already a whole bunch there, but go ahead and head over to that Reddit. I know a whole bunch of other streamers are watching as well. I am looking at my DMs on Discord for any questions that you do have, and we'll try to ask some questions towards the later half of the show. But yeah, go ahead, Asmon.
With we talking about the Reddit, and yes, having wrong opinions on Reddit, that's absolutely very, very true. It does, like, 100%. I think that's actually one of the negative things about, like, every type of medium has advantages and disadvantages. Forums have certain advantages, Reddit has certain advantages, and one disadvantage to Reddit is definitely that it does discourage people from posting things that kind of go against the grain. And I guess whenever you talk about that philosophy and communication, is that kind of where that post that you made last night for me, I'm not sure really what time it was for you guys over there, but the post that was made last night on the Reddit regarding the changes that are happening tomorrow?
Yeah, that was a post we needed to make because we made our announcement last week, and Reddit caught fire with a lot of people disagreeing with some of our changes. And we'd see situations where people were incorrect about some facts or needed more explanation, and there was little value in us jumping into that thread and debating it with them. We got to the point where posts that our community team were making in order to clarify factual things were getting downvoted to the point where they couldn't be seen anymore. There was little value in us even making those posts. It hurt our community account for it to get negative karma, right?
Oh, God.
And so if the community decides they don't want to hear from us, then it's very difficult. And so the purpose of my post was to both apologize for miscommunication we've had, explain situations that are misunderstandings, and to address a bunch of things that we felt were incorrect about recent community assumptions and stuff. And there are examples where, like, someone noticed that our patch notes were wrong in a way which could have been due to us balancing based on data that was on the wiki that was incorrect. The reality was that patch notes were written based on the data that was on the wiki because the person writing them was in a hurry with like 6 hours to go before they have to be posted and needed to get 1,000 things written fast. And so,
the real talk.
The post that was made to Reddit stated GGG is balancing in this way. They are doing this process, and everyone said, I knew it. And, it makes us look incompetent to go 4,000 upvotes. There are many ways that could have gone. That was a relatively aggressive one. And so we didn't want to just post in there saying, actually, no, because it looks defensive. And it was much easier to address many issues at the same time with a general apology for the fact that we are miscommunicating in this way. We should not be making those mistakes in the patch notes, and we should be clearer about that information.
I think that's a very interesting perspective, because I've noticed that with Path of Exile, there are some people that are very passionate about disagreeing, but I do think that many people would say that GGG does have a much better overall relationship with its community than many other developers, especially many larger developers. And how much of a role and how much importance do you place in that community role that you have and actually getting down there in the trenches and making posts and interacting with those people on that personal level?
It's critically important, right? Without our community, we wouldn't be here. Like, the community, they're the people who wear the Path of Exile t-shirts to LANs or to or to, GDC and stuff. They're the people who get their friends to play. I honestly feel that very few people pick up Path of Exile without a friend actually saying, dude, you need to play this game, and holding their hand through it. Having a community is vital. This is not a single player game. And so whatever we have to do to help the community understand our choices and to feel comfortable and excited about the future of the game, we will do.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it's definitely reassuring to hear that, because I know that having communities and having that open line of communication between developers and also the community just makes these changes so much easier to happen. And I know that there have been some cases in the past where there's been a whole lot of drama, etc. And it always sucks to see that happen, because you never know whenever that might draw a little bit of a wedge between the developers and the community. And, I don't think that really helps anybody. So I'm very glad that you guys have that perspective. I think that is the 100% best way to look at things.
Whenever there's drama, it's because we did something that upset people, and that's something we need to get the feedback on so that we can be very careful in the future. Either we don't do the action again, or we find a way of explaining the action better. And sometimes there are cases that are just difficult for us to do any other way, right? You have situations where contractually you're not able to mention something until some particular point, and then it looks like you're doing evil corporate stuff. And it's like, okay, guys, I can level with you and be sued, or I can be evil corporate because a contract requires something. And that kind of sucks, because I want to be candid. I try very hard for us to not get into situations where we can't talk to our community about stuff. But occasionally you do, and then it sucks to, they're corporate now, and that is kind of terrible because we hate corporates,
Yeah, and I feel like to a certain degree, it's like you almost agree with that. It's like, damn, I wish I could do this, but now we have to do this thing because of the contract. It does suck. I've been in a position like that before too, and it does definitely feel very disconnecting. Absolutely. There was something you mentioned a few minutes ago about having a friend that suggested Path of Exile, and I actually had a question about the ability for a new player to get into Path of Exile with the scope of how much that you need to know about the game. Because right now, whenever you play Path of Exile, I was going to do a meme where I just explained a little bit of the game, and it took an hour. And I'm wondering, do you feel like the amount of knowledge that a player has to have in Path of Exile is enough? Is it too much? Is it something that you're working on for PoE 2? Do you feel like, in general, knowing a lot about the game is necessary to succeed? Because of basically, like, right now, I mean, let's be honest, it's the same with every game. There's so much metagaming going on that everybody is going to Reddit, everybody's going to YouTube, and of course not everybody, so many people are. Do you feel like the complexities of the game are a barrier to entry, or are they a reward for the people who really understand the game and appreciate it?
I have a few comments here. So the first one is, people often tell us to simplify the passive skill tree at low levels so that new players aren't put off when they open the tree and see 1,000+ nodes.
The forest.
And our feeling strongly is that if someone's going to get put off by that, they're not going to make it through the rest of the game, right? Like, you can lie to them about what the game is, I guess, but they're going to find out eventually, and they're not going to handle it unless they can handle a bit of complexity. So number one is, there's going to be a bar where Path of Exile is a game for thinking people.
It's the filter.
Yeah, that's true. There's a filter there. But the other thing is, at the end of the day, you just click on monsters and they die, right? And you put your gems together, and it's not too bad to plod your way through the campaign. And it is absolutely fascinating watching people who do play entirely without assistance. Like, a friend of mine started playing Path of Exile recently on PlayStation, and I didn't help her with it. I didn't explain anything. Basically, she installed the game and just played through. And I check in on her characters occasionally, and there were crazy decisions made on those characters initially due to misunderstanding things, but she still made her way through the game. And upon getting to the point where it was too difficult, she said, okay, I know what I'm doing now. Made a new character, got a lot further. And she's on like her 4th or 5th character now, playing high maps. Honestly, further through the campaign on the live realm than I have had the time to play myself, because most of my testing is on local builds here. And that's from someone who has not had any handholding. I've never sat down and explained how the game works to her. And that was really good to see. And while I do believe that most players come in because of a social group and get all the assistance they need, and the average gamer these days wants to become, they want to be Kriparian, they want to be you. They watch your videos in order to be excited about what it's like to be a good gamer, and they're going to skip ahead to the right strategies that you are doing. And that's an amazing thing about influencers, because you get to inspire these people to see what they could become. A lot of people want to do that, but people who don't necessarily watch the influencers and just absorb the game at their own rate still have a lot of success. And my friend now is enjoying high maps and asking me build questions that I don't understand about my own game.
Well, that might be a little bit is it flattering or embarrassing or both? Probably a little bit of both, I would assume. Yeah, I would say so. Well, you mentioned a social experience, and Path of Exile is, of course, an ARPG, but you do have the social elements. You go into Ariath, you go into anywhere, and one of the main cities, and you'll see people around. Do you feel like the social experience in Path of Exile, do you think it's going to change a lot more in PoE 2, or is there going to be a larger social experience in the game as a whole? And I'll be honest, this is a little bit of a personal question here, because I'm an MMO player, and I'm curious to see if there's going to be any more social elements of the game.
Social stuff is critically important, and here's a little bit of a teaser. One of the things
Yeah.
on the scope for the October expansion is a little bit of a rework to guild stuff. I don't mean to tease too much of the future, but
Okay.
an example of what we're looking into might be guild hideouts. And so that's an example of the type of stuff we're exploring, because social is important to us. More information about that later. But we do critically believe that players being able to play with their friends and have an experience where they want to log in, not only to kill monsters and find good items, but just because that's where their life is quite important. And at the same time, we have the competing thing. We believe action RPGs should also be fully playable solo. And whenever anyone suggests raid content, we say, if we can find a way for that raid to be playable with one person in a fun way, then we'll do it. But social, of course, shouldn't be left by the wayside. So we both want to have it so the game is fully playable solo, because at the end of the day, your friends have to sleep before you do, and you just want to get another 2 levels. But in addition, being able to play with your friends is a great experience.
I love so many of the things that we've gotten here. You say, I think it's always cool to hear different things about a game that's actually made for the people who love the game and not the people who hate the game, and not trying to attract that audience. And hearing you straight up say, yeah, our game is a game for people who like to think a lot. That's something that gets me very excited. But I have received a bunch of questions from a lot of people in the community. The first one that I just kind of wanted to throw your way, and I know I already asked something somewhat like this, but this is from Ziz. Ziz asked, can you ask a question about there being less and less chase items or things to chase in the end game? So I wanted to throw that your way.
We very much feel it's important that there are a lot of items that you look forward to getting in Path of Exile. And when we're designing new uniques, for example, we want to make sure that there are ones that are just brutally powerful and brutally hard to get. Examples being Headhunter and so on. And so this is not something we're trying to reduce in the game. Now, situationally, due to various nerfs and bits and pieces, there may be items that were previously seen as chase that aren't quite so chase anymore. And if that means people feel that there's less compelling stuff to find, then that's not good, and we'll have to address that. Now, philosophically, one thing we've been working on here is to make sure that there are enough interesting items in the core drop pool. So when you kill a random monster, there's a chance it can drop a Mirror of Calandra, a Headhunter, various other stuff. And that's why in the last expansion in 3.14, we dumped tons of powerful uniques that were League specific before into the core drop pool. So there's a feeling of making sure that, every monster you kill could drop something really good. Now, I believe, having spoken to Ziz, that a lot of what he's looking for here is the concept of specific bosses having interesting drop pools of cool stuff that they can find, so you're incentivized to fight that boss. And I agree, good bosses should have good drops that are specific to that boss. We do have quite a bit of that in Path of Exile. We could add more. Of course, it's difficult knowing where to put new uniques we make. Do we put them on specific bosses, incentivizing that one, or do we put them in the whole game, incentivizing general play? One of the changes we have made in this particular expansion is really ramping up the rewards from Act boss drops. So, to some extent, we went and played a bunch of Diablo 2 and said, when you kill Diablo, what drops? Oh, like 3 uniques and a pile of rares, but no magic items necessarily. And so that was inspiring, because when you kill Katava in regular today's Path of Exile, you get a lot of blue items and a lot of yellow items, and it's just a complete spam. And so in 3.15, you will find that the rarity skew is much higher. You will get like a ton more uniques than before from Act bosses, but far fewer overall items.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm glad to see that too. Especially in terms of the item bullet that we were talking about earlier. And I do definitely see where Ziz is coming from, because there are those really, really cool items. And it's not just Watcher's Eye, and it's not just Shaper's items, but it's things like the Brass Dome from, let's say, the Minotaur, other types of different items that will drop, and they do make each individual run, you're kind of looking forward to that specific thing itself. Do you worry about having too many of those like really, really super powerful items, like, of course, Headhunter, Inspired Learning to a lesser extent, and just these super powerful items that people who are like really big power players can kind of put together and effectively make the Infinity Gauntlet that makes the game a joke?
I'm okay with it if they're hard to get, right? Path of Exile and
Okay.
other action RPGs are basically about becoming a god, right? Like at the end of the league, if you win, if you've won the game, then you are a god. You can kill all the content, and that's fine. Like I want people to be able to do that. Um, they shouldn't be able to do it easily, and it shouldn't be everyone who can do that. It should be a goal. Like ideally, it's one of those things where it's not an entitlement that you play for an hour every evening, and every one of you and your friends are all decked out in headhunters. That's a failure there. But it should be that you can work towards that goal, and if you're lucky, you can achieve it.
Very, very cool thing to hear. Now, this question, this is coming from Quinn69. He says, China has death logs. Why don't we? And then he said, smiley face.
Oh.
That's a great question. So what happens on the Tencent server is the final point of damage that kills you logs down which monster it was and what mods they had. And this was motivated by the fact that they wanted to teach new players about the fact that monster mods can contribute to deaths, and that was the motivation there. Now, this is useful insofar as the fact that if you're playing through the campaign and a rare kills you with specific mods, you can see that. But realistically, in complicated combat situations, tracking the last point of damage is honestly not particularly useful, right? Often you'll have a damage over time thing, like a low intensity poison on you, which is irrelevant to the combat in question, but because of the way the game ticks its damage, that happens to be processed first, doing the final point of damage to you. And so, well, why don't we make this better, I guess, is the question. And the problem is that tracking the damage, because what you're wanting here is to look at what functionally killed you. What was the thing that did the most damage to you recently? But recently is subjective, right? So you have to have it so now damage accumulates on you and damage falls off over time and it's tracked with which monster it was. And so we looked into doing this. And the server-side processing of tagging and storing and expiring the damage of every single point of damage dealt to players would slow it down by a lot. We would literally have to double the amount of servers we had, which would cost us millions of dollars extra per year that we just can't justify for this feature to do it properly. So then there's other ways to do it, like get the client to track it, for example. Have the server give far more verbose damage information to the client so that it can be done client-side. And that's a possibility. Again, it requires significant re-engineering, and we fall down a hole of basically asking at the end of the day, is it worth us delivering this after 3 months and saying, that's your expansion, damage tracking, I hope you like it? Because it's a lot of work, to be honest. And, we want it so you can visually see what's going on, right? With less clutter and better effects and better telegraphing, you died because the big guy hit you, is kind of where we want to go with that, rather than basically do a lot of data analysis work.
Yeah, and I do want to say thank you to all the content creators who have been reaching out, and I think it's really cool to see all the different content creators from PoE reaching out and really focusing on the elements of the game that they experience the most. Ziz talking about chase items and Quinn talking about dying. So I do want to say thank you to everybody, and I'm going to keep looking for more of the questions, and also going to be taking a look at the questions from everybody who's watching and posting different things on the Reddit and also on Twitter as well.
Yeah, I think having the death log does. I kind of assume that was probably why, is it would just take a ridiculous amount of computation and amount of data that you're going to give back to people, because whenever I've done path of building and stuff like that, and I have entire games that take up less processing power than path of building. So I can kind of expect that to be the case. Is this something that we could expect in Path of Exile too? Or is it something that is just not really a priority?
Well, maybe we can find a smart way of doing it, right? We like to make smart solutions to stuff, and there may be a way of only tagging damage that's large enough or something that comes up close enough, and then we can look into it. We definitely know the players want it, and I'd honestly just prefer to release it before Path of Exile 2 if we've got it, right? Like, I don't want to sandbag features for the sake of having a big Path of Exile 2 launch day. I'd rather have a better game in the meantime. But if we do manage to get this working in a good way that's not misleading, then we will certainly release it as soon as it's good.
Okay, that makes sense. I also have to go ahead.
Oh yeah, no. What Asmon said just kind of got my brain thinking about that first Path of Exile experience where it's like, okay, I'm gonna sit down, and like you said, you usually, I feel like for me at least, I did have a friend actually hold my hand all the way through. Actually, quite a few friends, and like trust me, I've had friends who I've watched play the game sometimes even on stream where they're just like, you think that they might know what they're doing at first, and then all of a sudden they're playing a Righteous Fire build with 5 life flasks, and you're like, oh my god,
he's talking about me.
Yeah, and it's like sometimes you feel like you can't even help your friends. And I think that there is also, though, kind of that moment where you realize if you really want to get as far as you can in the game and get that power level, you do have to look to a lot of different things outside of the game. You're looking at a lot of different resources. You're looking at going into Path of Building, you're maybe getting another add-on to actually help you price items. You're looking for so many different things. And for me, I learned about all of them from streamers and from videos. Mention Zizarin again when he does like PoE College, for example. I found that very helpful as a newer player. How important do you think it is to have content creators who are making that type of content? That's like, okay, I'm going to actually be that friend for you that holds your hand. And what's the relationship actually like between you guys and those content creators?
We think it's critically important, and we really appreciate everything that people do. And to some extent, I understand that people are making content that they're not really, like in many cases, necessarily making a lot of money off, right? Like they can make a build guide video for PoE and they're doing it because they enjoyed it and they want people to play their build, and they make like $50 actual revenue from doing that. It's not worth the time for many people, but they still do it because they're supporting the game and helping the community. And I also get that then we change the build and they've got to redo their video, right? That Essence Drain video needs remaking every single league. And so we do appreciate that, and we try to keep a good relationship with the content creators. If people reach out for us for assets and that kind of stuff, we make sure they've got what they need, try to answer questions and so on. Of course, we want to make sure that if we're giving information to content creators for their builds, we have to get that information to the community in general, so it's not some secret source they get to use that no one else does. But we basically want to make sure that they have what they need to create these materials.
Yeah, I think that's one of the coolest things, and it goes back to kind of what you were saying earlier about the relationship with the community at large. And content creators and things like that are kind of conduits in the community that other people watch, and having a good relationship with them just makes the relationship with the community as a whole just better in general. And I was kind of curious, like, obviously one of the big differences with Path of Exile versus a lot of other games is that it doesn't have an auction house. And I'm kind of curious, in Path of Exile 2, are you happy with the state of the trading in PoE right now? Or are you looking to change it and create a little bit more in-game systems that players are able to interact with and trade with each other without as much friction?
This is a complicated topic because there's two types of friction here, right? There's pure frustration, and then there's items being difficult to acquire. And we don't want people to be frustrated with the trade experience. There are things there which suck that we do want to find ways to improve. The tricky thing is we want to do this without making items substantially easier to acquire. And I'm going to tell you about my experience playing Diablo 3. I installed Diablo 3 on launch day, and I was actually having a lot of fun, right? I found items, they were cool, I killed the monsters, I needed better items, it was compelling, I upgraded my items, I looked for rares, I found a unique, legendary, I was having a great time. And then Jonathan leaned over and goes, hey, there's this auction house thing we haven't tried out. I'm like, there is. And we're talking about the gold auction house here. We're not talking about the real money one, right?
Yeah.
So I had some gold I picked up that I hadn't spent. So I searched on the auction house, and there's some good stuff. There's rares that are 20 times better than what I've got. So I buy them and have tons of gold left over. And my character's doing like 50 times as much damage now. I'm plowing through the monsters. And so I keep going, and it starts to get a bit harder 20 levels later. So I buy some more stuff. And the game's kind of easy, and I enjoyed it a lot less. And we see this in Path of Exile. When people are playing in solo cell phone mode, they're doing on average 10 times as many upgrades per item slot. They get to the end game more slowly, and they do it by having to claw their way through the items, finding better upgrades. And they spend a lot longer playing. And I'm not just talking longer to get to the same content. I mean, they get to further content. Whereas with players who are playing in the trade leagues, and trade is very important, I should add, but while players are playing in the trade leagues, they make like 3 item upgrades and they're at the end game. If they're smart, they play their league starter with a couple of key trades to get the stuff they need. They get some currency, then they make a couple of key trades for their final build, and then they sit there micromanaging a few % of the final items. And that's not great, right? I don't want to undo trade. I like the fact that this trade, the thing about having an item that your friends don't have also involves the fact you could trade it to them, but you're choosing not to, right? There has to be trade in the game. But if it's too easy, players just jump through the items too quickly. And so we don't want to try to combat that by just making stuff unreasonably rare, because we can balance it so trade is hard by just having it so the uniques barely drop and stuff. That's not the right direction. On the other hand, frustrations suck. It's not good when you're trying to do a trade because you need a little bit of currency and you just can't get it. And we're aware of this. With Expedition League that comes out tomorrow, one of the 4 vendors, his entire purpose is doing exchanges, unlimited exchanges one-to-one for the different currency that the vendors use so that you don't have to go to the trade system in order to frustratingly try to deal with another player to do certain exchanges there, right? That's important for getting equipment, but the amount of currency micromanagement here means that we don't want players to have to go to other people to do that one. And so we're very consciously trying to make sure that, it's not too frustrating.
I am very glad to hear that. I think that last week I spent maybe 10 or 20 minutes trying to find somebody to buy my Exalted Orb. So I'm very glad to hear that. Absolutely. And so what I'm hearing is kind of you look at the gearing process and the pursuit of trading and buying a new item in the same opportunity cost fashion, because it takes you a lot of time to do that. And that if you want to invest the time into doing that, you can. However, you can just continuously play the game and get upgrades as you go. Do you kind of view it with the same philosophy as picking up the different types of currency, with the opportunity cost of the time invested versus just being able to play the game on your own?
100%. If trade was instant, where you think of the item and it appears in your inventory, that would be a much worse game. It sounds good on paper, but then this basically means there's far less need to actually play. And we want it so that if you're choosing to go trade, that's something you have to go and invest a little bit of time in doing. You will get a great result. Like if you trade and get this amazing new sword for your character, you're going to feel proud of that. And I'm really happy that you get that experience. I just don't want it to take 4 seconds, right? That's something. I'll tell you a story. My good friend Brian, who is one of the founders of Grinding Gear Games, was so addicted to Diablo 2 that when he was young, there was a patch in Diablo 2 that introduced Lancers. For whatever reason, this type of weapon did not drop in the base game. And he was playing a Whirlwind Barb, and he really was looking forward to Lancers. They had the longest range. They could get really high damage. They were crutch, right? And so, clutch, not crutch. They were clutch. And he really wanted a lance. But the problem is he had to go on holiday to Taiwan at the point that lancers were getting released. And so he would sneak away from his family to go to a cyber cafe in the middle of Taiwan in some language he didn't speak to trade for a lance. And every night he would go out there and get a Stone of Jordans and try to get a lance because he was just so keen to get it. And his trade experience here took many nights out in secret before he got this item he was pleased with. And this is a story that's meaningful enough to him that I'm telling it to 65,000 viewers here, because that was a defining moment in Diablo 2, was that it was a real pain to get this one weapon he needed. And he felt so good for months afterwards because it was so impactful to him.
So we got the item though, right? He got the item, is that right?
He did get the item, yep. He still tells me about it.
I remember I remember the first place I was at whenever I got my first headhunter, and I remember that very, very clearly. So I think that's definitely a good thing. And yeah, having those items and being able to like kind of pick that up, and especially whenever you're trading and like seeing that perfect item that you want on the auction house and being able to finally buy it after looking for 3 days, there's kind of a value in it. And kind of like the friction between trading creates those points of excitement and creates those stories and experiences like that. Is that kind of what the general idea is?
Yeah, we want a bit more in that direction rather than the trivial item acquisition stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's important to us. And I think that trade is not in a perfect place. There's things we can do. Like at the moment, you have to alt tab out to a browser to go to the trade site, right? We could embed that in the game client. We could even have it so if you click someone in the game client's web browser, it automatically lets you message them. There's bits and pieces that are quality of life that could be done there. Some technical stuff making that difficult to do with embedding browsers in the game, but, you know, we can get through that. So I would expect it to be a little bit more streamlined in PoE 2, but don't expect it to be substantially different.
What other things can we really expect to see, like, in terms of a very large change from PoE 1 to PoE 2?
By far the biggest that we haven't mentioned here is the skill system change. Because there's this really bad thing about PoE that people have just learned to accept, but it's not okay. And that's the fact that as you play through the game and you find new equipment, you can't just wear it. Like, you find a new armor. What you want to do is put the armor on and play. But instead you're like, right, I have 5 or 6 links that are currently set up with obscure colors in my current armor. I need to replicate that in my new armor. Oh my god, this is terrible. You know, like, it affects new players because they find some new boots and they can't wear them because they've got a green socket and a blue socket together in their old boots, and they don't know that in the new one, and they don't understand, and they take the gems off and they don't know where they are. It affects existing players because you've got your perfect 6-link off-color setup and you're not reproducing that easily, right? Like, it's just terrible. And so the skill gem system in PoE 2 doesn't have that problem. The skill gems go in a separate screen, they're socketed into each other. Your items are clean. Like, your items don't have gems in them. It's so cool. You can just swap a new item in and keep playing. And that's the biggest difference that comes to mind immediately when I play through PoE 2's campaign.
Yeah, so I actually, I'll be completely honest, some of the stuff in PoE 2, I haven't gotten to, like what you have revealed, I haven't gotten to look at nearly as much. I think you've brought up some of the interesting give and take that sometimes systems will have, where when there's a pain, there's always that big moment of payoff, right? When you get that 6-link for the first time, it's one of the coolest memories that you'll ever have, whether it's in the particular league or if it's the first time that you've ever done it. So with the way that the system actually works, are you still kind of going about getting all of those links, like you said, just off your gear, but it still feels the same in that menu?
Yep. You're basically linking your gems now. So previously, Fireball is Fireball. Who cares? They're all the same pretty much. But with the new one, you want that 6-socket Fireball. You want the Fireball that takes a lot of support gems. And so good gems will actually be tradable again. Like currently in PoE, gems have literally no value. Like you have vendors where you can buy the gems for free, basically. In Path of Exile 2, getting a good 6-socket Fireball is going to be difficult, right? As hard as it is to get regular 6-socket items.
Do you view it kind of like, let's say, Awakened Hex Touch? Do you want to have like kind of more of the Awakened Gem meta where people get this really cool gem and it becomes another type of reward in the game that people can chase after?
Yeah, it's meant to be, honestly, like that.
Yeah.
And so we want it so that gems are these cool things that you're finding that you... Back in the good old days, it was hard to get multi-strike. You know, there were support gems that were seen as advanced ones that we just set low drop weights on and said good luck, and people would trade for them. And the gradual watering down of this now means you get them from the NPC.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And I feel like PoE 2 is kind of like that ability to kind of hit the reset button on a lot of those spectacle creep and scope creep things like that. And is that kind of what your goal is with that in terms of these different support gems? And do you think that people will have the same level of customization options with PoE 2 with the support gems now that we have them actually inside of the gem itself? Or will it be kind of a more on-rails experience?
We're trying very hard to introduce deeper customization options. An example is, it's actually being shown in the footage that's on the stream at the moment.
Yeah.
There's a meta gem, as it's called, which enables all of your auras at the same time. Like basically, it's like a gem that you can put multiple active skills in, and then it uses them simultaneously with various bonuses and so on. And so we're trying hard to have it so you can combine skills together in new ways. So you could, for example, and this is me just making stuff up, I'm not promising a skill here. You could, for example, have a thing where you put a skill with a minion, and that minion will use that skill inside a meta gem. This is not a thing. That's just me spitballing, but it's that type of system. So our goal here is that the system is strictly better, much easier to learn, and a ton deeper than before.
I have a kind of a personal question whenever you brought up the minions, is that whenever I'm playing with like Vol summoned skeletons or with a lot of carrying golems, sometimes I don't really know what's going to be underneath me. Do you feel like there's going to be a reduction in the overall amount of minions in Path of Exile 2 versus right now in the game?
We're going to try to target the amount that people feel is fun. I understand it's easy for us to just try to reduce everything because it reduces like clutter and that kind of stuff. And
it's
that's a
fun
good
to have 40 sometimes.
Right. Well, we just don't want to make it to the point where it's reduced to people not having a good experience. So we'll definitely be reviewing it. Like Path of Exile 2 is a good opportunity for us to look at the numbers and say the base gem is fine, but oh my god, you can triple it by all this other stuff, and then maybe potentially reviewing that. And so yeah, it will be looked at. And for those kind of changes, I'd prefer to gradually get them in before Path of Exile 2 comes out, because that way if we've made the wrong choice and people give us feedback, we're not jeopardizing PoE 2's launch day.
Yeah, I think that definitely makes a lot of sense, because I do think that sometimes whenever you have those first impressions, like we've seen game releases that have happened before, and the first impression of the release does kind of set the stage for people's perspective of it for the next like 2 years in some cases. You can have a bad release and it's considered, in beta for 2 years, even though the problem gets fixed in a week or something like that. So I think that is definitely very important to make sure you get that really good first impression.
Yeah, we're in quite a lucky situation. Like, I actually feel bad for companies working on the next generation of action RPGs compared to the competitive advantage we have here. Because let's say you're making Diablo 4, right? Like,
yeah,
you're making Diablo 4, great. Got a lot of burden there. So you want to come up with cool stuff for your game. You want to come up with cool ideas, ideally new ideas for action RPGs, right? So they make their stuff. Is it good? Well, some of it will be good. Some of it won't be good. Who knows, right? And so they're rolling the dice. Diablo 4 could be a 95% game. It could be a 60% game. We're only going to find out when we get to play it, and they don't necessarily know until they get to play it and it's finished. With Path of Exile, we know that's like a 90% game right now, in my opinion at least. And we can take it from 90 to 95 by being careful, by putting better graphics, better campaign, better skills, deeper systems, make it easier. As far as we're concerned, we're grinding out the 90 to 95% thing here by being really careful and by just making it good and modern, right? So we're releasing Path of Exile 2 already knowing it's probably a 95% game, and the other companies are hoping for 95%. And so that's just a big luxury that we have here because we have an existing game we can test stuff in the meantime, whereas they cannot take a Diablo 4 feature and put it in Diablo 3 necessarily. I mean, maybe they could. That'd be pretty cool. Don't do that, Blizzard. But they potentially are at a bit of a disadvantage there. And then, of course, the second issue is we have a decade of past content that's available on launch day. And it's crazy to think that when we launch our action RPG, it may have more content in it than a Blizzard game. But that's the situation we'll be in because of the fact we have all of these leagues and supporting infrastructure and 1,000 unique items and so on, just waiting on launch day that came from Path of Exile 1.
Well, that's actually what I think is so cool about Path of Exile. And I really think that, like, if you compare this to a lot of other games, the way they handle expansions, for example, after the expansion comes out, all of the content in the previous expansion is sometimes completely invalidated. And one thing that I found that was very interesting about PoE that I've liked, and I've actually used this example many times of good ways to introduce content, is that very rarely does content in Path of Exile truly become obsolete. And there are still people, especially, with the changes during the Maven League, is that whenever you had Incursion come back and have value again, whenever you change the way that Breach works again, and people are still excited to see some of these old features. And going into Path of Exile 2, do you feel like all of those different expansion features that have kind of accumulated over the past, say, 10 years, do you feel like that could be overwhelming for a player, or do you just feel like it will be seamless for even a new player to get into it and understand it very quickly?
I'm pretty sure we won't be dumping 30 systems in parallel where you get a little bit of each in each area because that would be overwhelming. But the important part is having ways to access them in the game. Ways where an advanced player can go, what's this breach stuff? How do I get into that? And then have the ability to play it. And so I think we're going to be taking a much more cautious approach with how you access this content, but it's probably all going to be still available. Like, people like each thing. It's not possible for us to really retire one of those leagues at this stage. We just have to make sure it's put in the game in a way where people can access it at the right time and that they get good rewards from it, but don't feel it's mandatory that their character engages in 30 different leagues worth of content every league.
Well, actually, that's a really that moves me to a really great question. And I've seen this brought up many times on the Reddit, and I've thought about this myself, is that whenever you talk about like mandatory content, and right now, obviously, the scope of what you have to do as content as your core character journey. Beforehand, it was mainly just level up, get your Atlas, and complete that. And now that we have the Atlas upgrades and all the other meta level content progression that happens at endgame, things like the Maven Atlas, things like being able to upgrade these other things, getting your watchstones, etc. Do you feel like the scope of getting your character up to par in a lot of ways has gotten too big? Because I've heard a lot of people say that the experience that they have is there are just so many things that they have to do every league, it's exhausting for them. Or do you think that it's enough for a serious player to do and find enjoyment and fulfillment in? And you look at those as kind of capstone rewards.
I agree with the feedback that the community have there, and I do think that is something that we need to work on. This is not a case of us telling people you are playing it wrong. I think they're playing it right, and those are legitimately reasonable feelings to have. We have our yearly Endgame Expansion coming up at the end of the year, 3.17, and I would expect to see significant improvements to that there. If we can make changes earlier that will help, then we will do so. I don't think the problem is as bad, for me at least, as some players are experiencing, but I do agree that this is something that is both common feedback and I certainly agree with myself. And I'm pretty sure there are other team members here who agree, team members who disagree, and we'll come to a conclusion that improves the game.
Cool. Yeah, I always think that it's really cool to look at some of the leagues and see like that the different layers of complexity they have. Like even with this league, I know one of the things that you mentioned is the actual order that you go about I like getting stuff out of the ground will affect how the mobs I'm completely blanking on what everything's called for Expedition, but if you hit things in a different order, it will affect how they come out, right? And it adds like a level of thought for a player to have. The next question though that I had comes from the community, and it says, this is a genuine question about talismans. Ask if he thinks that nerfing talismans was the right decision. It feels like very few talismans were used in 3.14, but in 3.13 they were in a really good place.
We're more happy with where talismans are at currently. They're a pretty good place they're at, and 3.13 was damn powerful. We're still trying to find the right place for many different itemization things, and we were pretty unhappy with the 3.13 implementation of it. It was improved on too many axes at the same time. It'll probably see changes in the future. As you know, we're working on a lot of itemization stuff, right? And talismans are items, so they'll have to be affected along with our other changes.
I'll be honest, I got really excited back then whenever I would loot a talisman because there would be some insane lottery drops on those talismans. So I'm glad to hear that. I definitely am. I think that, having those cool little items, especially that, like talismans you can drop and it's just randomly super good. I think that's really cool. So yeah, I'm definitely a fan of that.
Maybe that's their place then, right? Maybe we just make them as super lottery drops that you get occasionally and be careful with where we give them out. But yeah, it's a conversation we're having in an ongoing manner.
Rich, you got another question?
I'm looking through them right now. Most of the questions on the Reddit right now, guys, are pretty much all about new player experience. And then, people from the community. I'm looking on Discord and Twitter as well if you want to keep asking questions.
And so also I wanted to talk a little bit about success metrics because I read your post that you made just yesterday or today, depending on where you live. And you were talking about how the metric of like concurrent players or whatever is not necessarily the only thing that you want to look at. It's not something that you necessarily say more concurrent players equals better game. So could you give me an idea of what you do view as a success metric for the game and how you view success of the game and what does that really mean and what does that look like to you?
My personal success metric is how many of our team are asking for time off to play it at launch, right? What I want to see is that we get gutted at work by everyone annoyingly going and playing the game. In leagues that we've released in the past that were bad, they may have had good player numbers, but our team, who know in advance what the content is, some people just chose not to play it. That's a bad sign, right? So we can look, holy crap, look at how much money we made, or look at how high the player numbers are, but realistically, we know this was not our best content in some cases. And so that's important because player numbers are all about hype, and hype is all about promises, and promises are all about creep, right? If we said, tomorrow's league drops one unique item per area, guaranteed, blah, 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 blah. Look at all these rewards. Look at this thing and this thing. And we just totally inflated everything. We'd probably get record player numbers because people want to play circus mode PoE with all these rewards and so on. That would not be a good game. That'd be a step backwards, but it would have rewarding player numbers, right? We could take our supporter packs and everything and triple the amount of contents in them and reduce, provide discounts on points and get record sales. We could break our previous sales by 50% and be totally wrecking the future of the company if we needed to. So it's too easy to cheat the vanity metrics, but it is not easy to cheat people wanting to take time off work to actually play this game and forego their income to do it, if you know what I mean. So that's why I look at actual excitement for the product.
I know all too well what you mean. I've done that multiple times and it's been great. So I think that's actually a really good success metric because you just look at it on like a very personal level. I agree with that a lot. Go ahead, Rich.
I know both sides of that coin all too well. This is another question from the community, just asking, with the Royale event and flashbacks in general, are you happy with the cadence that you've had with these, or do you think that there are any more plans to increase the amount of events like this later in leagues?
So what we often do is we run special flashback events in the weeks leading up to a new release. It's good because it gets, pumps up player numbers during the quiet month, but it can be bad for a couple of reasons. The first one is that it can wear people out if it's too close to the new release. If you've just pushed really hard to play a big event and then release is coming up a few days later, you may be tired, and we want to make sure that's paced well. In addition, from an expectations point of view, if we run a flashback event which drops tons of items and it's super exciting and fast-paced, and then the new league comes out, if the league feels boring in comparison because it's paced, for a 3-month period, that could be an issue. And so we're quite careful to make sure that we run events only at the right times and don't accidentally hurt our league launches as a result. At the moment, we're doing Royale events, so that was running over the weekend we just had, and then for every other weekend of this league apart from the launch weekend. And so that's completely different, of course. It's not, a race so much as it is a cool Battle Royale PvP thing, and it's been pretty well received so far. We're, of course, going to be looking at how player retention goes over the course of the league, whether or not our balance changes between weekends are going to have enough impact to keep player numbers high, because Battle Royale games, due to needing 50-plus players per game, per region at various times of the day, they really only work when there's enough of a player community. Now, so far, it's looking like tens of thousands of players are interested in playing Royale at any one time, which is great. And hopefully it continues to thrive throughout this league. But honestly, we'll see what happens. If people don't want to play it, we'll just do it occasionally and it'll be a special thing. If people want to play it a lot, we'll run it more. We'll put more effort into making new maps for it, porting new skills and uniques across, and more features, team support. But we just need to see people actually engaging with it. And the feedback we've got so far has been super helpful. I know it gets to the point where, like, you know, one skill takes over after a couple of days once it's solved, but that's why we're just going to patch it between the weekends.
That makes sense. Yeah, I haven't had a chance to do the Royale thing, but I watched the trailer recently to it, and actually it's kind of interesting. So I think that it's not going to be this weekend, but the weekend after, I think it's going to be available again. I might actually try that out. And whenever you were talking about like one skill available, this is kind of like an interesting question because there are some builds, and this is a build that I wanted to play this league. I don't know if it's still going to be viable. It's an auto bomber where basically you just run around and Herald of Thunder kills everything for you. That sounds great to me. And basically, it's my goal always in ARPGs is to put in the littlest amount of effort possible and still complete them. And I was wondering, whenever you're designing the game and you have builds in mind, is there a certain amount of buttons or spells that somebody is supposed to use in order for like a build to be successful? Like, would you say that your goal was to have a build take 3 buttons, 1 button, 5 buttons? Like, do you have a metric for that at all?
Different players want to play with different amounts of attention, right? We just don't want it. The best builds are the simple ones, right? Like if what you're doing here of wanting to be lazy, if that's like the best way to play, so everyone does it, maybe that doesn't provide the opportunity for people to feel like they're being interactive. If you want to play that way because you want your action RPGs to be chill, then fair enough. It's good that you have the option. And just we want to make sure that the more skill involved, the better results someone actually has.
Yeah. And I think that was like, actually, that's a really good point because I remember whenever there were some nerfs to minions, and for a while, the best minions were just zombies, and you would just sit there and there was no interactivity with the zombies. And then that was changed to where there are more minions that you could resummon and do different things with rather than just kind of have these same minions over and over. So is that kind of like the same philosophy with this?
Yeah, absolutely. We've got this new minion coming out in tomorrow's expansion, the Reaper, which basically just eats your other ones. Like she's controllable. You can say attack here, and she like dashes over there and smashes the monsters, and then will eat in nearby minions to gain bonuses. If she's low on life, she'll just work her way through your army, consuming them. And you kind of need other minions to feed her, but most of it's about you just like running around with her, killing stuff.
Wow.
Yeah.
A bit more interactive than the previous like wait for your zombies to kill everything kind of mode.
Yeah. Or carrying golems or whichever one. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that makes it more interesting. Absolutely.
Yeah, I saw some questions about the Reaper, but I might have to come back to it because I did lose them when I was looking at the other one, and also I got distracted by what Asmon said. But yeah, I actually ran that auto bomber build. I was running one made by MB Extreme. You should definitely check it out this league, Asmon. I think you'll like it a lot. But this question is from the community. It says, could you ask Chris what's the point of nerfing Awakened Gems? I've seen a lot of questions about the Awakened Gems in 3.5 and questions about Cirrus. As an endgame boss with like what is the purpose of Cirrus now? Does this shift the purpose of that endgame boss?
So I was not personally in the discussions about the nerfs for the Awakened Gem, so I can't give you the exact rationale for the team made. It's very hard to keep on top of every single base when there's so many changes. My understanding that's been explained to me is that the new balance for them still makes them better than the regular gems, but it's trying to combat power creep by providing better versions of gems that are not as much better as they were before. So there is an intention to nerf it just for power reasons, but they are still the thing that you want to be getting for your build. Now, the team have heard the feedback, right? They can definitely see the threads and the disappointment about those changes. It's going to prompt conversations, right? I'm going to ask, now it sounds bad to say I'm going to ask some hard questions, but I'm certainly going to ask questions, right? Like I'm not angry about the changes. I agree with the direction. I just want to make sure that it's fully understood. And if I feel that that was a bit overboard, I'll make sure people know that for the future. Though I should emphasize, like, it's not entirely my decision for this stuff, right? Like, to some extent, I'm the mouthpiece taking what the team have decided and justifying it to the community. In some cases, in many cases, I'm having to explain decisions I was completely unaware of. And if I'm unaware of them, that is my fault, right? I'm not blaming the team. It is my responsibility to be aware of all the changes. And so one of the things I'm trying to do is to make sure I am on top of more of this for upcoming leagues. I've made sure for 316 everything is communicated to me so that I'm able to actually explain properly in these circumstances why the change was made.
It's so nice to actually hear answers like that. I mean, usually when we have interviews like this that we don't actually expect to hear always the full truth, and I very much appreciate it. I have another question though coming from Quinn's community. It's about Spellslinger. This is another one that I've seen popping up a whole bunch. and the sentiment is something that I've seen in a few different places. So I'll read verbatim what he said. People feel like it got somewhat double whammied. Are you guys are you internally reconsidering how Spellslinger functions? It feels like the archetype is no longer going to be viable. That was a question from another one of the.
So this is one I wish I had asked some people about. I actually had it on my list to check because I knew this was going to come up as a topic, and I meant to last night before I went home get more information from the team. Unfortunately, they were busy getting stuff ready for the release. They've definitely heard the feedback. I don't know if there are any changes coming in before launch. I suspect not. I suspect they think it's in a good place, and this is something I'll check in on. It may be that we can make some changes on the last day if necessary, but I honestly don't know what the situation with that is. But I promise you, I'll bring it up, and if we've made a mistake, we will try to rectify it. And if we have justification for it, then I'll make sure that this is included in communication. Whenever we're next, posting reasoning behind stuff, we'll explain so that people are less confused about those changes.
That makes sense. Simple question. Do you think that there are sometimes you'll go into a map and the map will have like 2 or 3 different mods that kind of just stack on top of each other and take a character that has like a huge amount of survivability and it literally just one-shots them. Like they're dead, they're like deleted. And this has happened to me, it's happened to many people. I love watching the clips of it happening to people in hardcore, to be honest. But I'm curious to know like what your stance is on that. Do you think that's just more of an instance of people not really playing as carefully as they should? Or do you feel like one-shots are a little bit too much in the game right now?
The intention with the map mods is that players will roll a map that they think they can handle. A good map is about the right level of difficulty. It has drawbacks that miss your character, like, turning off stuff you aren't using, and has things that improve the drops as a result. So a perfect map for you will not make the game any harder, and it gives you a bunch of rewards. Whereas a terrible map to run is one that temp chains you with no way around that and turns off your ability to do damage, and I don't know why you're trying to run that map. You should chaos it, if you see what I mean. So if people are not reading their maps before they run them, that's one of the consequences. Now, we could water it down so the mods don't impact characters and it's just a slew of ways that you're slightly slowed and ways that you're slightly, getting better drops. But we'd rather have it that the mods are impactful. And that's why, like in the Expedition League, there are these things called remnants that you can blow up to make the expedition encounters harder. Those things have some really swingy mods on them. Like, you've got to read those, otherwise stuff gets very hard. And we're doing that on purpose to kind of train people. This is a game about decisions. I know you want to go fast, but take a second to check what you've just signed up for in some cases. Now, the topic of one-shots is a big one, right? Like, I'm not necessarily happy with where one-shots are game-wide. I think a lot of this is the spammy nature of combat. While we can try to telegraph an attack, if there's a ton of stuff going on, it's going to be missed potentially. And so we do want to make sure that players don't feel that they're unfairly one-shot. I agree that like death logs and so on, like we discussed before, could help with that situation.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, I think that does kind of make sense. And I think it's also like a degree of like visual clarity as well. And I know that's been like a problem, especially for like certain minion builds and things like that. Whenever you have like a bunch of things that are cluttering up the screen, and it's kind of hard to see exactly what it was that was hitting you, or you're not seeing it in a way that it's supposed to be telegraphed. And like, I'm curious, this is like an interesting question. Do you feel like one of the drawbacks for minions is the fact that they make it harder for you to see things, or is that just kind of like an unintended consequence of playing a minion build?
That's not an intentional consequence. It is certainly a consequence that if you, like in real life, if you hire a bunch of 30 guys to run around with you and defend you, then it's going to be a pain to see what's going on. But it's not something that we're trying to encourage, if you see what I mean. Like, we don't want that to be a drawback. We'd rather have stuff be clear. If fewer minions is still fun and means that you get a better idea of what's going on, maybe that's the right direction. We just want to be pretty sure that it's actually really fun to have, less minions than you currently do.
Okay. That makes sense. And I do want to say, like, obviously, like, there's been a lot of questions we've talked about with Path of Exile 1, but I've seen some of the footage for Path of Exile 2, and I really like the visual clarity in the game. And I think that especially it's something that it's been iterative over the years. But if you go back and you look at something from even 2016 and then 2012, even before then, there have been massive visual upgrades in the game. And in terms of the Path of Exile, like character customization, and this might not be something that's like super important to a lot of people, but for a more RPG-oriented person, do you plan on having more elements and more ways of character customization in Path of Exile too?
We don't currently, and this is a tricky one because a lot of people want the ability to put like
Yeah.
earrings on their characters or change the hair color and so on.
Mhm.
It's just that you get covered in equipment so quickly. Like when we've done our internal tests, you put some armor on and you can't see the changes. Like it's really just I understand there's a feeling of making the character your own, right? But it's also like
Yeah.
we also don't support male and female versions of the characters. This was actually a big topic like 8 years ago when Diablo 3 announces that it's got its male and female versions, and we didn't. Um, why don't we? And part of it's that you're kind of playing the storyline of a specific person. Like, the Marauder did these things. This is a guy, and you are playing the Marauder, whereas the Witch had this other experience, and you are now playing her. And to some extent, because there is the Witch and you are the Witch, it's different than being, oh, there are lots of witches, and for some reason they all kind of look the same, but it's cool because you can give your one earrings, or tattoos and stuff. So that's partly why we've been going for you are playing this exact character and then you cover it in whatever armor and microtransactions you want to. Now, that could change. This is not a philosophical stance, I should add. This is not us putting our foot down and saying no character customization. It's merely being
Priorities.
Priorities. We don't feel it matters a lot for Path of Exile. We could be wrong. We may change that.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And going into PoE 2, what would be some other like very large changes that players can look forward to, like transitioning from PoE 1 to PoE 2?
So the game has a much better campaign, I should add. We have like professionals working here, people that have like degrees and like experience making this one. When we made PoE 1, it was our first game. Like Jonathan was just out of university. Eric had done he'd written a book about like industrial design. I'd been a programmer and hadn't made any games before. Like it was us just coming up with stuff, right? Act 1 is saying what would be cool. Act 2 is like, what if we could construct a situation where players can inadvertently PvP each other, right? Like in the bandit encounters.
Yeah.
It was just us coming up with stuff on a whiteboard, and then we got it made, and in some cases made quite badly. Like the Path of Exile campaign is not a particularly good product, if you see what I mean, by modern standards. Whereas the Path of Exile 2 campaign is being made by a highly paid team of 150 plus people who have decades of game experience on a game with tons of feedback. Like, it's just so much better. The writing's better, the quests are better, it looks better. It's just so much more fun to play through. And then we get to use all of that in the maps. Like, it's just a much better game.
I mean, it doesn't get more simple than that. Yeah, I mean, there you go. Yeah. So whenever PoE 2 comes out, are we going to have the PoE 1 campaign at all, or do we just immediately do the PoE 2 campaign?
The way it works is you download Path of Exile, and when you launch it, you can choose whether to make a character in the original campaign or the new one. And so you choose to play PoE 2, you make a new witch, play through the new storyline, and then you get access to maps. And if you play an old witch, for example, through the old storyline, you get access to the same map endgame. And so the idea is that you can basically meet up with characters who've played through the other campaign, which is why they're of similar lengths and so on.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I like that. Go ahead, Rich.
Yeah, no, cool. That was the first time I had actually heard that. This is another question I'm grabbing from the community. This was actually going on during the previous discussion. It got sent to me. It's just around balance and whether or not sometimes the balance focus does tend to be in like softcore trade league, because there are questions around defenses being something that the exact wording here is, why are you guys so hard on defenses sometimes?
We don't balance around solo self-found because we see solo self-found and hardcore as optional modes to make the game harder. I should add, I play both solo self-found and hardcore together because it's the right way to play Path of Exile for various reasons. It's for at least my type of
doing it wrong.
Game. I want to play solo self-found hardcore, but we definitely don't balance around these. These are optional things you choose to put yourself through because you're masochistic. There are things we could do, for example, to make it that solo self-found players or hardcore players got what they needed. There could be some way of getting specific unique items that you can just grind to get a build-enabling thing. In hardcore, there could be much easier ways of getting defenses, but we do not feel that it is correct for us to modify the games around these modes. Instead, those players who are advanced players need to solve those problems themselves. They need to find ways to get the items they want. They need to find ways to get the defenses they want. Having said that, we want to make sure you can get items and you can get defenses. Like, we're not philosophically opposed to either of them, but we certainly don't want to try to solve it by just shimming in a system that will give it to those players.
Yep. That all sounds fantastic. This is another question. This is from DatMods. Is there a plan to declutter some of the older, more dated League mechanics that went to core and make the game more intuitive?
Yes, but not a firm plan. Like we definitely want those mechanics to be better over time. We did a rewards pass on those on the last expansion. So yeah, absolutely we'll keep doing work on them. Not in 3.15 or 3.16 though at this stage.
Okay. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Especially, it's kind of like something that's more iterative, where it's like right now, it seems like the goal is to kind of get player power more in line for a better transition into PoE2, and also just better like character progression in general. And then obviously, we'll probably see more of those things happen in the future in the next like couple of leagues or so leading up to PoE2. Okay, that's pretty much what I had expected. Rich, you got another one?
I'm looking for another one right now, actually.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, I know that like for me personally, it's been very exciting to be able to do this episode and just straight up ask the questions that I've been wondering for like such a long time. So I do want to say, as we get into the more question-based segment of the show, thank you so much, Chris, for coming on. Really, and yeah, this is awesome for me. I've loved this game for a long time, and actually just having some of the answers just that straight up is actually just very refreshing. I think that's one of the big words that I would say, is because especially now with and this is kind of like a question I might have, do you ever feel like you worry about communicating things in a certain way because people might take them a bad way? With I know you said like with Reddit, etc. Because nowadays I think that some of the game studios, it feels like almost whenever they're making a statement or talking about their game, it's like a press release from the government or something like that.
Yeah, 100%. Like I know there are things I said in this interview that are going to create Reddit threads, right? I've got a list of messages on Discord. I say certain things, and 4 people at work message me, and I'm thinking, "Yep, I'm about to be told off for that one," right? Like I think I revealed a 3.16 feature earlier, and it's a bunch of stuff. But it's better to be honest, right? Like it's better to communicate well, to give people the information they need, to explain the reasoning. We're only human. We're working under tight development times here. It's like a 91-day cycle between these releases that we have to conceptualize, develop, and communicate it. There's going to be mistakes. We're going to screw up the patch notes. It's crazy that we haven't. In fact, like, let's talk about patch notes for a second. Like,
okay.
The poor girl who was handling the patch notes this time was so sick, and she did it from home while sick, put in so much effort, and I really want to call that out and thank Stacey for sorting that out, because it was her first time doing the patch notes, and she'd made a mammoth effort, and we had no resources for anyone else to do it. And that's an example of Reddit's just sitting there having personal attacks at whoever it was who made these few mistakes, and I'm thinking the amount of care that went into not making more mistakes here. In fact, those particular mistakes weren't even her oversight. That was information from someone else on the team. But either way, there's a lot of effort being put in by a lot of people to try to get this stuff released. And I feel the least I can do is communicate that clearly and give players a genuine personal experience as to, a window into our development cycle.
That's a great way to look at it. I agree with that. It's kind of like you're giving people that ability to just have that human element to it. Like these are people that are doing these patch notes. This is not a robot. This is not this massive corporation of 15 different people that are looking over it, and it takes 6 months to do. It's much more real. It's much more direct, and I think it's much more honest. And so I agree with that a lot. And also, I'm curious, like, we've seen a number of private leagues pop up, right? And, Ziz has done a number of private leagues as well. And I've watched some of them too. I think they're very interesting. How do you feel about private leagues as a whole? And do you think that the initiative has been successful?
Private leagues were a Chris feature. That was something where I said, our game needs this. It was meant to be there from the beginning, guys. Just do it. And they said, okay, you haven't mentioned it before. And I said, right, well, I am now. We're doing this. And there's various different motivations here, right? The first one is essentially group self-found, right? We got solo self-found in. Group self-found lets you have a group of 5 friends, and you're going to go and play that, see how far you can get as a group, right? The second thing is the ability for you to kind of... There was this Penny Arcade comic a very, very long time ago about World of Warcraft where there were these 2 people playing together, and one of them logs off and comes in the next day, and his friend is partially infused with infinity, is the line, where basically it's on this giant glowing mount with incredible armor, because if you're playing a game with someone and you go offline while they're still playing, you come back and they've engaged with the trade economy and they're just in maps, And so private leagues allow you to have a league where the person can't scamper off and trade for a bunch of stuff necessarily. They're kind of having to fight alone once you go offline. And so this is an experience that we feel is very important, that it lets people play at the pacing of their friends. And there's other things I'd love to do with private leagues. Like I want to put in a system where you can limit it to certain number of hours per day. So you and your friends can have a private league where you can only play for 30 minutes a day. So you all have 30-minute windows to try to make progress to see how far you can get during that time, or it guarantees that you play together without the ability for the people to play while you're offline and so on. So there's various features. This is all optional, of course. We don't make a lot of money from private leagues. Few people use them, but those that do really like them, and they're an important part of the game. And it's awesome when people can use that system to run these big events for the community where people get a chance to play some of these quite difficult private league mods that make the game harder.
Okay. Yeah, I've seen a few of them, and the 30-minute per day league, it always reminds me of people that are, playing a game and they're talking about how they only have an hour a day to play, and it's like, oh, that sounds like it would just be perfect for them. So that's actually a quite interesting way to look at it, because I guess, yeah, you could do that. Another thing about just PoE 1, and this is something that I think has kind of started to happen a little bit more recently, is the aura stacking and aura bots. Do you feel like that is too much of do you think that that's good gameplay? Because there are people that have so many auras they can stand in cirrus clouds and not lose health.
We have a situation where a person putting an aura on because they want to use a single aura is fine. We don't have any problems with auras. They're good, right? They're balanced. You have a reservation, right? And a person who stacks a bunch of auras and focuses on the benefits of it for themselves, they've paid a high cost. They've reserved a lot of resources. They've allocated passives in this. They are kind of screwed by the fact that they've got these aura stacks going on in their own character. Things are fair. And then the party impact of having a dude who's got all these auras on and doesn't have to worry about the opportunity cost standing next to you and buffing you gives you a big impact. And that's part of the problem here. But that is a party member who would otherwise be contributing damage by himself. And yes, the auras do contribute probably more damage, especially when you have a large party. So it is probably something that needs attention. But we're very careful about this because we don't want to just make auras worse. We have to find a way of making it so that those characters have more of an opportunity cost for the party without just reducing the ability of individual players to use auras. And the plan for that is not something that we wanted to rush into 3.15. So for the time being, it's still okay. The good news is it's a real pain to play with people because people are people, and it's hard to get them online at the right times and so on. So there's an implicit opportunity cost with having to have an aura character playing with you. It's often more efficient to just play solo than to do that. But that's not a particularly good consolation for the people that feel that other people are getting an advantage by using aura bots. So we're aware of this. There will likely be changes coming. It never honestly came up in our internal development for this league. And people have joked that Mark Neon, who's one of our key developers, have played this type of character in the past and therefore is trying to protect it. But he was brought the list of nerfs by other staff members for his approval, and the Aurabot stuff was not on that list of nerfs, so he didn't surreptitiously drop it. It just wasn't even brought to him by other people. It was a surprise when the community came up with it, and it's interesting how this happens on Reddit occasionally, where we're about to make a big announcement, and we're happy with what's in our big announcement, and the players will say before the announcement, I wonder what's in it. It could be anything, but I hope it's this thing. And they'll come up with a thing which isn't in our announcement. And then everyone else, you're right, it has to be that thing. GGG would be blind not to fix this thing, right? How can they not fix it? So we do our announcement, which doesn't include that thing because it takes more than a day to make a game. And they say, you are so out of touch. And we probably need to nerf robots here.
Yeah, I mean, I was curious about that. I've seen some of them, and it's crazy. I'll watch the videos just kind of in awe. I'll be like, oh my God, like how... I didn't even know there were this many in the game, but somehow somebody's been able to do it. And I do find it very interesting. And I think that's one of the cool things about PoE on the flip side is that somebody can just do something that's completely ridiculous because there's just so many variables, so many things that can happen, is that you do have those outliers. And there is a certain degree of appreciation for the outliers, but it is good to know that there's not some... it's not like a cartoon villain over there at GGG who's just not nerfing his own favorite spec. Is that right? Yeah, that's about it.
We've had a situation in the past where, like, I've been playing Path of Exile at home and I've come in the next day and said, guys, we need to have a chat about the stuff that I'm doing. To some extent, when we see something that's overpowered, we're more likely to nerf it because of the fact that we understand how bad it is.
I think that's what's good thing about like people that play their own game, like just on a straight up level, you have to play your own game. And if you don't play your own game, you're not going to know what the hell's going on. So I'm definitely glad to hear that. Absolutely. Rich, got another question?
Yeah. So this one actually keeps popping up a whole bunch. People are just asking a lot of questions about Reaper, and I know that you were already talking about it, but the general sentiment is just people wanting to have more information on it. So is there anything else that you could say about Reaper?
I've exhausted the information that I know here, but I'm aware that players want to have like more stats on how the actual minion works. So what I'd love to do is please the crowd by promising that we're going to make a post today with all the details about Reaper to make sure you're planning your builds. But it's a busy day, right? Like we still have to like finish this league. Let me just check. There are like dozens of issues still to go that the team will work on. And while I can give my time to answering questions here with no problem, I don't want to distract those guys to make a Reaper post when instead they could like make the game 5% better. So I'll see what I can do about getting more information about it out, but at the same time, we may just have to wait until tomorrow.
Yeah, and once again, thank you for coming on the day before you launch. It's pretty crazy.
Thank you for having me at the right time. That really helps the promotion of the expansion. It's a great benefit. And I don't know if this is okay to clarify, but when Reddit saw that I was coming on, they all assumed this is a paid sponsorship. Like, it isn't, right? Is that okay to say that this is something you're doing? Because
okay, guys, y'all have to understand. I played this game for 8 fucking years. I don't need it to be a paid sponsorship to be excited and want to bring Chris Wilson, somebody whose game I've played and I've loved for 8 years, guys. It's not no paid sponsorship. We're having fun. I am so happy to do this. Chris, thank you so much, man. Yeah, there's no exchange here. Can you guys send me a shirt though?
We can send you a shirt.
Okay, all right. I'll follow up with that later. Yeah, I'll definitely follow up with that later.
Made an apparel.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, I'll do that for sure. I already have one hoodie, so I'd like to add one to my collection.
X tells me that a shirt is on the way. So
already, okay, all right, there we go. Awesome. All right, go ahead, Rich.
So it is now paid, I guess.
Oh, great. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, no, in all seriousness, if we ever do a paid sponsorship on the show, we will make sure that everybody knows. A lot of the focus of Allcraft, though, is very much changed to just be stuff that Asmon and I are excited about playing, and I think you've naturally seen that shift. But yeah, I think we will make it very, very apparent when there is a paid sponsorship on the show, like our sponsorship with NordVPN. And you guys can actually check right now down in the panels and in chat if you do want to see the actual sponsor of the show, which is ongoing. It is the permanent partner of Allcraft. So you can use code Allcraft if you do want to support the show for NordVPN.
Keep that in mind, guys. Yeah, it's literally against the law to not say that it's a sponsorship. Okay, and
we have done sponsored streams for Allcraft. I believe actually the first
it is possible to be excited about a game without being paid for it. I know this might be a surprise in the year 2021, but it's absolutely possible. And I guess to wrap everything up, obviously we've been going on for quite a while, Chris, and I know you're probably extremely busy. What is the main thing that you want to tell people like going into Expedition League?
I'm just gonna say have fun, right? That's a good one. Right. The core mechanic manages to have this cool way of letting you decide what kind of monsters you want to fight and what kind of rewards you want to get without taking very much time. Like when I'm placing my expeditions, it's like 6 seconds to quickly put my stuff out. And then I always feel that I did it wrong. I always feel I should have placed stuff in a different way to get better results. And I've been really enjoying that. So I just recommend go in with, an open mind for the expansion tomorrow. I know some of the balance changes are scary, but play it. You'll have fun. Make some crazy builds. Impress us, right? There's 19 new gems. We want to see some stuff that makes us cry. Not Reddit posts. I mean, YouTube videos about builds. We want to see the permutations of what you guys work on. Really, really clever stuff. Cool combinations of stuff.
The unintended things that need to be hotfixed immediately.
Try to avoid the hotfix immediately ones if you can.
All right,
but no, there'll be plenty of immediate hotfixing, I'm sure, with some of these interactions.
Okay, all right. Well, that sounds good. Rich, you want to have one last question?
Yeah, I can look for a few more. Also, if you guys do want to just tweet any of those questions out or throw them in the chat, I can grab them very quick, and then we can find one to wrap. But one more time, just want to say thank you for getting this together so quickly. And like I said, thank you for coming on the night before. And guys, be sure to check everything out tomorrow. And I'll look for that last question now, Zach.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I do want to say, I think that the league, I mean, especially with a big league like this, because really you're having a lot of changes. There's a lot of things that are different. I think the main thing that I'm excited for the league is the changes to the support gems, because having other ways that you can play your character and have your abilities work is actually one of the most interesting things to me, especially leveling up. And it does feel like whenever you go into maps, you are kind of funneled into those same, 4 or 5 different support gems that you're just kind of expected to have. And maybe you swap out Controlled Destruction for a boss, but that's about it.
Yeah, this will bring back the Path of Exile to Path of Exile in many ways, right?
Okay.
The creativity and the interesting combos and stuff.
Well, that's definitely good to see. It absolutely is. Yeah, I'm very excited for that. I'm gonna probably try that Reaper thing out. I'm hoping that it's gonna be good because I've played Minions many leagues, and every single time it goes really, really well until it doesn't. And so I'm curious to see if this is going to be the exact same thing. Rich has actually seen that happen many times himself personally.
Yeah. I will say I'm getting this question a lot. I know that you did already answer it in the Q&A that you did with Ziggy, but I'll bring it up now because it is the question I'm getting the most. People just asking about general stuff with what to expect with servers tomorrow when they're actually trying to log in for the first time.
So we fixed the problems that happened last league launch. We had some dumb database stuff. We had some dumb problem with our queuing. Both of those are resolved. We're expecting things to be fine. It's rarely perfectly fine, but we will be on it. We have a lot of people that are going to be sitting here, well-fed, well-hydrated, ready to go. They'll be screaming. It'll be I want to do a documentary of league launches at our office. It's fascinating. From the waking up at 4:30 in the morning to like someone yelling, "What the hell is going wrong?" It's really interesting being on that side of it, but there will be good communication, right? I will make sure that if anything goes wrong, there's going to be a thread where we're explaining what's happening. Fingers crossed, though. The server guys tell me we've got plenty of servers, we're ready for a lot of players, and all the issues we're aware of from the past have been sorted out.
Well, I mean, that's as good of news as you can possibly expect. But yeah, I mean, as I said, I do want to say that thank you very much for coming on. I don't want to take too much of your time. Obviously, you've got a very big day ahead of you tomorrow. And so I do want to say, again, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for all the answers. And thanks for making the game. It's been a lot of fun. I look forward to playing.
You guys have been a big fan for a while, and it's awesome to do this. It's been great.
Absolutely. Well, anyway, guys, thank you all very much for watching today. And guys, if you don't know already, pathofexile.com, Google it, find it, whatever it is. Game's free to play, and new league's coming out tomorrow. I'll probably be playing it soon, if not tomorrow exactly. And I think it comes out at 1 p.m. my time, 1 or 2 p.m., somewhere around midday if you're in the U.S. And is that right, Chris?
Yeah, that's right. It comes out about 24 hours after this podcast started.
Oh, all right. Yeah, there we go. So yeah, somewhere around there. Thank you guys all so much for watching. Thank you again, Chris, and everybody in the PoE team for making this possible. Thank you. And we are going to be moving over to the after show on Rich's stream. So if you guys have any questions you want to ask us or have any conversations about it, etc., please go ahead and stick around, hang out, and we'll try to drag some people in and have those conversations that you guys definitely do want to have, that we like to do. So again, thanks a lot, Chris, for coming on. Really appreciate it. And that's pretty much all we got.
Thank you, Chris. It was nice meeting you. Good luck tomorrow. Excited to play.